Hello everyone, welcome to today's tutorial. My name is Priska Serali of Gold Imperial Academy, where we teach students pattern drafting and garment construction. On today's tutorial, we'll be taking a look at how to create the yoked maxi dress with gathers. This tutorial is something that I have always wanted to do, but I've never had time to do it. So today we'll be doing this. So yep. All right, I have this very lovely Ankara fabric print right here. Okay, so I'm going to be flipping it to the wrong side because I'll be making some markings on it. I'll be using my basic bodies to know what level to have my yoke. Okay, this dress is going to be having a yoke. However, I'm going to be inserting a basket weave yoke into the dress, and I already have a tutorial on this. Please check the description box for the link to the tutorial. Okay, so moving ahead now, I'm going to use the hip of my basic bodies to mark out my hip measurement. So all I'll just do will just be to take the measurement, and I have 9.75. Thereafter, I am going to mark out the fabric needed for the remaining part of my dress. To know the fabric to use from the across chest level of my garment right here, that is my maxi dress, I can multiply my hip measurement by 2, or I can do 2.5 or 3 depending on how full I want it to be. I don't want it to be too big, so I think I'll just do either 2 or 2.5. So you multiply that 9.75 in my case, you use your own measurement. Remember that this is half of our front pattern, so I can either use my full hip measurement and then multiply that by 2, then divide by 2. So that means if I divide by 2, one will be for the front and one will be for the back. Hope you understand. I can do my hip measurement, multiply by 2. Whatever that value is, I will divide by 2 again, apportion 1 to the front and 1 to the back. Okay, so I could do that. Or you can get whatever half of your value is and then multiply accordingly. So for me, I'm going to be multiplying my hip. My hip is 38. I'm going to be multiplying that by 2. 38 multiplied by 2, that gives me 76. So I'll divide that by 2. That means for the front I will have 38, for the back I will have 38. Now I can either do that, or I can do like either add half of that value of that 38 to the hip measurement. Since I have 38, I can divide that by 2. That gives me 19. Then I'll add that 19 to my 38, which is my round hip measurement. This figure is without the seam allowance, please. So I'm going to go ahead and, depending on how wide you want yours to be, okay. So for me, because of the fabric that I have just 2 yards of fabric. So I'm going to also keep that in mind as I am choosing the dimension to use for the fullness of my gathering. So I can do my hip divided by 2, then add it back to my full hip measurement. So if I'm adding 38 plus 19, that gives me 57. Yeah, 57. So I can now divide 57 by 2, apportion 1 to the front, apportion the other to the back. So if I divide 57 by 2, that gives me 28.5. So I can do for the front 28.5, for the back 28.5. Now remember, I'm going to be gathering this to my yoke. Okay, so this fullness is what will continue to the hem of the dress. So the fullness that you want will determine what you will be adding. Determine the length of my dress. Remember that I said it will have a yoke. My dress length is 40. I have a yoke of 7 inches already, so I'll do 40 minus my yoke. 40 minus 7 inches gives me 33. So the length of fabric I will cut to make up for the full length of my dress will be 33. Remember that I'll be adding seam allowance to hem it, 1 inch to hem, 0.5 to join it to my yoke. So make sure you add all those allowances. So I folded my fabric in 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, because I want to have one piece for the front and one piece for the back. It's going to have a side seam, and I've also made allowance for that side seam as I was cutting. So the next thing I'll be doing will be to mark out 1 inch for my hemming allowance at the hem of this fabric. So I'm just going to mark that out 1 inch. Okay, so I'm going to be doing my length measurement from here. If you have these markings, you can cut it out or either use it as part of your hemming allowance. So since my 1 inch is going to take that in, I'll just leave it. I wouldn't cut it. I'll just use it for hemming the dress. The next thing to do will be to measure out the length of my fabric. Okay, so to measure out the length of my fabric, I'm going to be deducting the length of my yoke from the full length of my dress. So 40 minus 7, my yoke is 7 inches. Take that away from 40, which is the full length of my dress, then we have 33. So I'll just mark that 33 right here. Okay, and also mark it on the other side so I can connect in a straight line. So next, I'll be marking my seam allowance to join it back to my yoke. Okay, so you always make provision for the seam allowance to join your fabric to your yoke where you have a yoke seam. Next, I'll connect everything in a straight line like so. So it's the seam allowance that I'm connecting now. Okay, so here we are. So this is what I'll be cutting. So since it's going to have a side seam, I can add a side pocket or a patch pocket, whichever one that I want. I can add to it. So I can now separate my fabric. Here is my fabric, one for the front and one for the back. So I'm going to be running a basting stitch on this and then gather it to my yoke. So this will be the body of my dress. Now before I begin to gather my fabric, I'm going to make provision for the remaining part of my armhole curve, okay, because my yoke ends at this point. So I have to make provision for this remaining part of my yoke, except you are not going to be adding a sleeve, but for this I'll be using a sleeve, so I have to make provision for that. So all you just do will be to place your pattern, and if you are using freehand, just curve it out. I added a seam allowance of 1 inch to this, so I measured 1 inch and then went inwards and placed my pattern, and then I'll draw out my curve now. So the next thing I'll do will be to now make an allowance for sewing. So this is it. So I'll be cutting this away. So this is now what I will gather for the front. So I'll repeat the same thing for the back and then gather. To gather, you can use the loose stitch of your sewing machine, but because I want these gathers to be quite obvious, I'm going to be using my needle and thread. If I use the loose stitch of my machine, it's going to be quite tiny, but I want it to be bold and obvious, so I'll use the needle and thread to do a basting stitch and then pull it into a gather. Now I'll begin to gather. I'm using a needle and thread. I have a contrasting color so I can see it easily. Okay, so to begin, I'll go in by 1 inch or 0.5 because I'll be sewing, so keep that in mind when you are gathering. So I'll just do this. Okay, in out. This is actually basic. Okay, we are also teaching this in our kiddies class. Yeah. So just keep doing this till we finish up. I'm done with the gathering. So this is it. You can use the loose stitch of your machine, or you can use needle and thread like I said earlier. I've also pinned my basket weave yoke on the gathered part. The link to how to create this will be in the description box, so you can follow it and create yours. So the next thing I'll be doing now will be to sandwich this in between my fabric and my lining. So this is my lining. You can use a complementary color for the lining, but I'm using this. Okay, so I'm going to gather this as well and then attach it so that I can sandwich my yoke in between the lining and the fabric. So I'm going to take this to my machine. So gather this first and then sandwich my yoke in between and then sew.